Most people inside Rusty's diner saw the old biker and looked away before he could look back. They saw the black leather vest, the gray beard, the scar running beneath his left eye, and the Hell's Angels patch across his back. But none of them saw the folded funeral notice that would soon bring hundreds of motorcycles to a tiny Tennessee chapel for a man they had never met. The rain had stopped less than an hour earlier, leaving the highway slick and dark under a low November sky. Water dripped from the red awning above Rusty's front door, falling in slow, uneven drops onto the cracked concrete step where cigarette butts had gathered in the corner. The diner sat on the edge of Pinewood, Tennessee, the kind of place people passed without remembering unless they needed gas, coffee, or a bathroom key attached to a wooden paddle. Beyond the parking lot, the hills rose brown and bare, stripped by autumn, with thin fog still hanging between the trees like smoke that had forgotten how to leave. Thomas Reaper Vaughn pulled his Harley into the gravel lot at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, the engine growling low enough to make the windows tremble. He was 69 years old, though most people guessed younger until they saw how carefully he got off the bike. Not weak, never weak, just deliberate. His knees had been ruined by too many years on cold roads, too many fights outside bars with names nobody remembered, and one crash in Kentucky that should have killed him before he ever turned 40. He stood for a moment beside the motorcycle, one gloved hand resting on the seat, his shoulders wide beneath the soaked leather, his beard silver at the chin and black at the jaw, his eyes pale and watchful under the brim of an old black cap. A young mother walking out of the diner pulled her little boy closer when she saw him. Reaper noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't react. He simply stepped aside so they could pass, lowered his head in a quiet nod, and held the door open for them while rainwater slid from the edge of his sleeve onto the floor mat. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt coffee, fryer grease, wet coats, and maple syrup. A jukebox in the corner played an old George Strait song barely loud enough to rise above the clatter of plates. 3 truckers sat at the counter, 2 deputies occupied a booth near the window, and an elderly couple shared a slice of pie beneath a framed photograph of the town's high school football team from 1986. When Reaper walked in, conversations didn't stop. Not exactly. They only thinned for a second, like people had lowered the volume on their own voices without meaning to. Carla, the waitress, saw him first. She had worked at Rusty's for 23 years and had known Reaper for almost all of them. She knew he took his coffee black, hated onions, tipped too much, and never caused trouble unless trouble came looking for somebody smaller than him. But the new busboy, a skinny 17-year-old named Mason, didn't know any of that. He froze with a gray tub of dishes in his hands, staring at the patch on Reaper's vest like it might move on its own. "Relax," Carla muttered as she passed him. "That one's safer than half the church crowd." Reaper slid into his usual booth at the back, the one near the window where he could see both the door and the parking lot. Old habits did not retire. He removed his gloves, finger by finger, laid them beside the napkin dispenser, and looked out at his Harley sitting alone in the wet gravel. The chrome was streaked with rain. The saddlebags were dusted with road mud. Tied to the rear rack was a small canvas bag containing 2 shirts, a bottle of aspirin, a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, and a photograph of his daughter he had not shown anyone in 12 years. Carla approached with a coffee pot before he asked. "Same thing," she said. "Same thing. You look like hell." Road was wet. Road's always wet when you decide to ride through a mountain storm. He gave the smallest hint of a smile. "Keeps tourists home." She poured his coffee. "Breakfast special?" "Make the eggs hard. Last time they looked nervous." Carla snorted and walked away. Reaper wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into his fingers. His knuckles were swollen, scarred, ugly things. Hands that had built engines, broken jaws, buried friends, lifted children onto motorcycles at charity rides, and held dying men on the side of highways while sirens screamed too far away. People saw the hands and imagined violence. They never imagined tenderness. That was fine with him. A man could survive longer when strangers misunderstood him. He had ridden into Pinewood that day because 3 brothers from the Tennessee chapter were supposed to meet him there before heading east: Kane, Bulldog, and Preacher. They were running late, which meant Kane had probably stopped for ribs, Bulldog had probably argued with a gas pump, and Preacher was pretending not to be the reason both of them were delayed. Reaper checked his phone once, saw no new messages, and placed it face down on the table. Then, the bell above the diner door gave a small, tired jingle. At first, nobody paid attention. An elderly woman stepped inside, bringing with her a breath of cold air and the faint smell of rain-soaked wool. She was small, almost fragile, wrapped in a navy coat that hung from her narrow shoulders like it had belonged to someone stronger. Her white hair was pinned into a bun at the back of her head, though several loose strands had escaped and stuck to her damp cheeks. She held a black purse in front of her with both hands, gripping it so tightly her fingers had gone pale. She did not move toward a table. She stood just inside the door and looked around, not like someone searching for a seat, like someone searching for courage. Reaper noticed the way her eyes passed over the truckers, the deputies, the elderly couple, Carla at the register, Mason near the kitchen. He saw the tiny movement of her throat as she swallowed. He saw her take half a step backward, as if she had already decided this was a mistake. Then her eyes landed on him. For one long second, the old woman stared at the massive biker in the back booth. Reaper expected fear. He was used to it. But what crossed her face was not fear of him. It was desperation. And desperation, Reaper knew, could make a person walk toward the last man in the room anyone else would approach. She moved slowly across the diner, each step careful, her shoes leaving faint wet marks on the tile. Carla saw her and started forward with a menu, but the woman shook her head without stopping. The deputies glanced up. One trucker turned on his stool. Mason lowered the dish tub an inch. Reaper sat still. The woman reached his booth and stopped beside the table. Up close, she looked even older. 80, maybe more. Her eyes were pale blue, rimmed red from crying, and there was a bruise-colored shadow beneath them that sleep could not fix. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then forced herself to speak. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you." Reaper looked at her for a moment, then pushed the opposite seat out with his boot. "You're not bothering me, ma'am." She glanced at the seat but did not sit. Her hands tightened around the purse. "I know this is strange," she said, "and I know you don't know me. That's all right. My name is Dorothy Brennan." Reaper nodded once. "Thomas Vaughn." She looked at the patches on his vest, then back at his face. "Do people call you Thomas?" "Not usually." "What do they call you?" "Reaper." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but it vanished quickly beneath something heavier. Grief, maybe. Grief had a way of making fear seem small. "My husband died 4 days ago," she said. The sentence landed hard, quiet, and final. Carla stopped moving near the counter. Reaper's expression changed, not much, just enough that the hardness around his eyes loosened. "I'm sorry," he said. Dorothy nodded as if she had heard those words too many times and none of them had touched the part that hurt. "His name was Arthur. Arthur Brennan. We were married 63 years. Reaper said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that silence sometimes gave people more room than sympathy. Dorothy looked down at the purse in her hands. He was a carpenter, built half the porches in this town back when his knees still worked, fixed church doors, school benches, kitchen cabinets. He never made much money, but people used to call him when something broke. A thin, painful smile pulled at her mouth. He liked being useful. Reaper glanced toward the window, then back at her. "The funeral is tomorrow morning," she continued. 10 o'clock, Pinewood Chapel. Her voice held steady until that point. Then it began to shake. "Our son died 12 years ago. Cancer. Most of Arthur's friends are gone now. The ones still alive can't drive or don't remember much anymore. I called the funeral home yesterday because I wanted to know." She stopped, pressing her lips together. Reaper leaned forward slightly. Dorothy blinked hard. "I wanted to know how many people had confirmed they were coming." The diner had gone almost completely quiet now. Even the jukebox seemed too far away. "They said 2, Dorothy whispered. 2 people. For a man who lived 87 years. Reaper's fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Dorothy lifted her eyes to his, and what he saw there stayed with him for the rest of his life. Not embarrassment, not pride. A widow trying not to beg and failing because love had left her no other choice. "He made me promise," she said, before he got too weak to talk much. He held my hand and said, "Dottie, don't let them put me in the ground with nobody there." Her voice cracked on the nickname. I told him I wouldn't. I told him people would come, but I don't know how to make that true. Reaper did not move. Dorothy swallowed. "I saw your vest," she said. "I saw the motorcycles sometimes come through here. I thought maybe men like you know what it means to stand together." Her eyes filled with tears. She had been fighting since she entered the diner. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything improper. I just need someone to sit in a pew. I need someone to be there when they say his name. Please." The last word almost broke her. "Please don't let them bury my Arthur alone." No one in Rusty's diner breathed loudly after that. Reaper looked down at the table. For a moment, all he saw was his own reflection in the dark coffee, older than he remembered, more tired than he admitted. Then, in the silence, another memory rose inside him without permission. A military cemetery in 1974, 6 folding chairs, 3 empty, rain tapping on a flag-draped coffin, and a 21-year-old Reaper standing beside the grave of a man who had once saved his life. Nobody should leave this world to empty chairs. Nobody. He pushed the coffee aside and stood. Dorothy instinctively stepped back, not because she feared him now, but because he was so much larger than she expected when he rose to his full height. Reaper reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out a small leather notebook with a pencil tucked in the spine. "What's the chapel address?" he asked. Dorothy stared at him. "Pinewood Chapel," she said quickly. "It's on County Road 9, just past the cemetery gate. I wrote it down." Her hands trembled as she opened her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. Reaper took it carefully, as though it were something breakable. "What time should I be there?" he asked. "The service starts at 10. "I'll be there at 9. Dorothy covered her mouth with one hand. "And Mrs. Brennan," Reaper added, his voice low and firm. "Your husband won't be buried alone." For the first time since entering the diner, Dorothy's face changed. It did not become happy. Nothing could make that day happy. But the terror in her eyes loosened just a little, like someone had taken one stone off her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you." Reaper nodded. "He already gave me a motorcycle." "I reckon that counts." A small, broken laugh escaped her before turning into a sob. Carla hurried over then, wrapping an arm around Dorothy's shoulders and guiding her gently toward the door. Before leaving, Dorothy turned back once. Reaper was still standing beside the booth, the folded address in his hand, watching her like a man who had just been given an order he intended to obey. When the door closed behind her, Rusty's diner remained silent for 3 more seconds. Then, one of the deputies cleared his throat, looked down at his plate, and pretended very hard that his eyes weren't wet. Reaper sat back down. His breakfast arrived 5 minutes later, but he did not touch it. He stared at the paper Dorothy had given him. Pinewood Chapel, Arthur Brennan, 10 o'clock. A good man, an empty room, and one widow trying to keep her final promise. That was when 3 motorcycles rolled into the parking lot outside, their engines breaking through the gray afternoon like distant thunder. Kane walked in first, broad as a doorway, with a shaved head, a scar through one eyebrow, and a beard braided with 2 silver rings. Bulldog followed, shorter, heavier, wearing a denim jacket under his leather vest. Preacher came last, tall and thin, with tired eyes and a cross tattooed on the back of his hand. They were laughing about something when they entered. Then they saw Reaper's face. The laughter died immediately. Kane slid into the booth across from him. "Who heard who?" Reaper placed Dorothy's folded note in the center of the table. "Nobody yet," he said. Bulldog looked at the paper. "What's that?" "A funeral." Preacher slowly removed his gloves. "Whose?" Reaper looked out the window, where Dorothy's small figure was disappearing down the sidewalk beneath the dull November sky. "Man named Arthur Brennan," he said, 87 years old, married 63 years, being buried tomorrow morning with 2 people coming. Kane's jaw shifted. Bulldog leaned back. Preacher lowered his eyes. Reaper picked up the note again and folded it once, carefully, along the original crease. "Not anymore," he said. Then he reached for his phone. Kane didn't touch the folded note at first. None of them did. It sat in the middle of the table between the untouched eggs, the black coffee, and the four men who had spent most of their lives pretending nothing could still get under their skin. Outside, the last of the rain slid down the diner windows in thin, crooked lines, blurring the parking lot into gray shapes and chrome reflections. Inside, Reaper's phone rested in his palm, but he had not typed yet. He was still looking at that paper like it weighed more than it should have. Bulldog was the first to speak. 2 people? Reaper nodded once. For 87 years of living? That's what his wife said. Kane looked toward the door Dorothy had walked through. Where's the family? Son died, friends gone, world moved on. Preacher let out a slow breath through his nose. He had been called preacher for 29 years, not because he was holy, but because he had once talked 4 drunk men out of killing each other behind a roadhouse in Chattanooga using nothing but scripture, threats, and a pool cue. He took off his cap and set it on the seat beside him. That woman walked in here and asked you? She asked whoever looked like he knew how not to leave somebody standing alone. Bulldog glanced at the deputies near the window, at the truckers pretending not to listen, at Carla wiping the same clean spot on the counter for the 3rd time. And everybody heard? Enough of them. Kane's face hardened. Then this town ought to be ashamed. Reaper finally unfolded the note again. Dorothy's handwriting was small and careful, the kind of script people used when they had learned penmanship, before everything became screens and shortcuts. Pinewood Chapel, County Road 9, service at 10 o'clock, Arthur Brennan. Under the name, she had added in parentheses, my husband. That detail stayed with Reaper, not because he needed reminding, but because she did. As if once the funeral home printed the papers, once the pastor said the prayer, once the dirt went over the casket, the world might start calling Arthur something colder. The deceased, the body, the remains. Dorothy had written my husband because that was who he still was. Reaper opened the group chat. He did not send the message right away. There were rules to things like this, even if outsiders never understood them. Hell's Angels didn't move because someone wanted attention. They didn't ride hundreds deep because a stranger asked for a spectacle. A patch meant weight. A call meant responsibility. You did not summon brothers lightly, and you did not use the name for decoration. Reaper knew that better than most. He had seen men earn respect through blood and lose it through ego. He had buried brothers who never got old enough to regret what they had done, and he had watched others grow soft in the eyes after becoming grandfathers, though they still wore the same leather and rode the same roads. But this was different. This wasn't about noise. This was about silence, the kind that waits inside an empty chapel. He typed slowly. 87-year-old man being buried tomorrow at Pinewood Chapel, Pinewood, Tennessee. Wife says only 2 people are coming. She asked that he not be buried alone. Any brother within riding distance, full respect, no drama, no exceptions. Service at 10. I ride at dawn. He looked at the message for a long moment, then he added one more line. His name is Arthur Brennan. Remember it? He sent it. For nearly 15 seconds, nothing happened. Then Kane's phone buzzed, then Bulldog's, then Preacher's, then Reaper's screen began to move. Knoxville rolling. Memphis chapter sees this. 3 from Lexington. I'm in Nashville. Leaving before sunrise. Bringing flowers. Does widow need anything? How many expected? Not enough. We fixed that. More messages came. Then more. Some from men Reaper knew, some from names he had only seen in state runs, some from riders who were not even Hell's Angels, but close enough to understand the call. Veterans, mechanics, old road dogs with bad backs and good hearts, men whose children did not speak to them anymore, men who had lost wives, brothers, sons, men who had stood at graves in small towns and remembered how cruel an empty folding chair could look. Carla approached the booth with fresh coffee she hadn't been asked for. What's happening? She asked quietly. Reaper didn't look up from the phone. Tomorrow morning, that chapel won't be empty. Carla stared at him, then at the 3 men across from him. How many are coming? Kane watched the messages climb. Depends how much sleep people are willing to lose. Bulldog gave a humorless little laugh. So a lot. Carla pressed one hand to her chest. Lord. Reaper finally picked up his fork, pushed the eggs around once, then set it down again. His appetite was gone. Across the diner, the deputies exchanged glances. and one of them, a young man with a blonde mustache and the stiff posture of somebody still new enough to believe the badge made him older than he was, stood from his booth and walked over. "Everything all right here?" the deputy asked. Kane slowly turned his head. Reaper raised one hand slightly, stopping Kane before he could speak. "Everything's fine," Reaper said. The deputy looked at the phones buzzing on the table. "Heard something about a funeral." "That's right. You expecting people?" "Yes." "How many?" Reaper looked at the screen again. "More than 2. The deputy shifted his weight. "Town's quiet. Folks get nervous when a lot of motorcycles show up." Reaper studied him for a moment, not angry, just measuring. "Folks should get nervous when an old woman has to walk into a diner and beg strangers to attend her husband's funeral." The deputy's face tightened, but he didn't answer. Preacher leaned forward, his voice calm. "Nobody's coming to cause trouble. Nobody's drinking. Nobody's making noise during the service. We're coming to stand, pray, and leave flowers. That bother anybody?" The deputy looked at him, then at Reaper, then at the note on the table. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't bother me." "Good," Kane muttered. The deputy hesitated before walking away. "I'll let the sheriff know there may be traffic." Reaper nodded. "You do that." When the deputy returned to his booth, the diner slowly exhaled again. But something had changed. The people who had looked away from Reaper when he first walked in were now looking toward him in a different way. Not comfort, not trust exactly. Something more uncomfortable than both. Recognition. They had judged the leather before they understood the man inside it, and now that mistake sat with them like a cold plate. Reaper stood and pulled a 20 from his wallet, leaving it beneath the coffee mug. Carla saw the money and shook her head. "You barely ate." "Give it to Mason." "The busboy?" "He looked scared of me. Fear burns calories." Carla almost smiled, but her eyes were wet. "You really think they'll come?" Reaper slipped his gloves back on. "They're already coming." Outside, the air had turned sharper. The 4 men walked to their motorcycles beneath a sky the color of old steel. Reaper stopped beside his Harley and looked east, toward the hills where Pinewood Chapel sat somewhere beyond the bare trees. He imagined Dorothy Brennan walking home alone with her purse held tight, not yet knowing that the world had already started moving because of her. Not knowing that men were leaving garages, trailers, repair shops, and cheap motels. Not knowing that engines were being checked, fuel tanks filled, old black vests pulled from closets, boots dragged from under beds. Not knowing that her husband's name was now traveling through Tennessee faster than gossip, faster than pity, carried by men who understood one simple thing. A promise made to the dead had to be kept by the living. Kane lit a cigarette and squinted at his phone. "We got maybe 50 confirmed already," Bulldog grunted. "By morning, 100. Preacher looked at Reaper. "You know this could get bigger than you think." Reaper swung one leg over the bike. "Good. What if the town doesn't like it?" Reaper started the engine. The Harley roared to life beneath him, deep and steady. "Then the town can learn manners." They rode out together, 4 motorcycles cutting through the wet afternoon, past the gas station, past the dollar store, past the church sign that read, "Blessed are those who mourn," and onto the county road that climbed toward the older side of Pinewood. Reaper did not go back to the motel. Not yet. He needed to see the chapel. Pinewood Chapel stood on a low hill beyond a narrow cemetery, white clapboard walls weathered by decades of rain and summer heat. The steeple leaned slightly to the left, and the gravel drive curved around a patch of oak trees with leaves plastered wet against the ground. Beside the chapel was a small sign with removable black letters. Someone had already placed tomorrow's service notice there. Arthur James Brennan, 10 a.m. That was all. A whole life reduced to a name and a time. Reaper killed the engine and sat there staring at it. The others parked behind him, but did not speak. The chapel windows were dark. Beyond them, rows of pews waited in shadow. Reaper imagined Dorothy sitting in the front row with 2 people behind her, and all that empty wood stretching away like an accusation. He imagined the pastor speaking too softly because there was no crowd to carry the words. He imagined the hearse at the curb, the casket rolling out, the sound of one widow crying louder than the hymns. No, not tomorrow. He stepped off the bike and walked to the chapel door. It was locked. He peered through the glass and saw the sanctuary inside, clean and modest, with faded red carpet down the center aisle and a wooden cross mounted behind the pulpit. On a side table near the front, someone had placed a framed photograph. Even through the glass, Reaper could see Arthur Brennan's face, old, thin, smiling gently beneath a cap, not famous, not powerful, just a man who had loved one woman long enough to become part of her breathing. Preacher came up beside him. "Something about him familiar?" Preacher asked. Reaper frowned slightly. "No." "You stared like you knew him." "I know the kind." Preacher accepted that. Behind them, Kane's phone buzzed again and again. "Reaper," he called. "Kentucky's bringing 30. Georgia's got maybe 25. Knoxville says they can be here with 60 if weather holds." Bulldog looked toward the small chapel parking lot. "This place won't hold them." "It doesn't need to," Reaper said. "Road will." Preacher looked at the cemetery. "Widow know?" "No." "You gonna call her?" Reaper thought about that. He had her address from the funeral notice, not her number. He could find it if he wanted. He could send Carla. He could warn her. But something stopped him. Dorothy had spent days preparing herself for emptiness. Maybe just once, life could surprise her in the other direction. "No," he said. "Let her sleep thinking one man is coming. Tomorrow she'll see the rest." That evening, Pinewood began to hear rumors. At first, it was nothing more than a waitress telling her sister that a biker had promised to attend Arthur Brennan's funeral. Then, the sister told her husband, who worked at the feed store, that Hell's Angels might come to town. By 6 o'clock, the story had become 20 bikers. By 7, 50. By 8, the sheriff had received 7 calls from concerned residents, 1 from the chapel pastor and 1 from the funeral director, who wanted to know whether he should request additional parking cones. Sheriff Dale Hargrove was 62, tired, and old enough to remember when Arthur Brennan had repaired the porch steps on his mother's house without charging her, because she had just lost her husband. He listened to the calls, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling fan ticking above his desk. His youngest deputy, the same one from the diner, stood in the doorway. "You want me to call the state boys?" the deputy asked. "For what?" "In case there's trouble." Sheriff Hargrove looked at him. "Did they say they were bringing trouble?" "No, sir." "Did they threaten anybody?" "No." "Then why would I call state police on men riding in for a funeral?" The deputy flushed. "People are nervous. People get nervous when they see things they don't understand." The sheriff picked up his coffee and grimaced because it had gone cold. Arthur Brennan was a better man than half this town deserved. If bikers are the only ones willing to show respect, then maybe the rest of us ought to be the ones embarrassed. The deputy said nothing. Hargrove looked out the window toward the darkening street. "Put 2 units on traffic in the morning, quietly. No sirens unless somebody acts stupid." "Yes, sir." "And Jenkins?" The deputy paused. "Sir? Don't be the stupid one." Across town, Dorothy Brennan sat alone at her kitchen table beneath a yellow light that hummed faintly when the refrigerator kicked on. The house around her felt too large now, though it had only ever been 5 rooms. Arthur's coffee mug still sat upside down beside the sink because she had not been able to put it away. His slippers were near the back door. His reading glasses lay on the arm of his recliner beside a folded newspaper from the week before he went into the hospital. Ordinary things had become traps. Every object waited quietly until she looked at it, then broke her heart again. She had not told anyone about the biker yet, not the funeral director, not the pastor, not even her neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, who had called twice that evening and offered to bring casserole. Dorothy did not know why she kept it to herself. Maybe because she was afraid if she said it aloud, it would sound foolish. Maybe because she feared the man called Reaper had only been kind in the moment and would forget by morning. He had looked sincere, yes. His voice had been steady. But people made promises around grief the way they placed flowers near hospital beds, beautiful at first, gone soon after. She rose slowly from the table and walked into the living room. On the mantel was a row of photographs, Arthur in his army uniform, Arthur holding their newborn son, Arthur standing beside the first house he built with his own hands, Arthur at 50, laughing with a fish too small to brag about, and one photograph hidden partly behind a vase because Dorothy had moved it there years ago and never moved it back. She took it down. The picture was from 1958. Arthur was 22, standing beside a motorcycle with his hair slicked back and one hand on the handlebar. Dorothy stood beside him in a white summer dress, laughing at something just outside the frame. He looked wild in the picture, freer than their grandchildren would have believed if they had lived long enough to ask. Before the carpentry business, before the mortgage, before their son, before arthritis bent his fingers, Arthur had loved motorcycles. He had ridden everywhere: county fairs, state roads, midnight runs to nowhere. Dorothy used to climb behind him and wrap both arms around his waist, pressing her cheek between his shoulder blades while the world blurred past. "He would have liked you," she whispered, thinking of the huge biker in the diner. Then she corrected herself. "No, he would have talked your ear off." For the first time that night, Dorothy smiled. It lasted only a second. Then she pressed the photograph to her chest and cried so quietly the empty house seemed to lean closer to hear her. Far away, on highways slick with rain and shining under gas station lights, motorcycles kept moving. One rider left Lexington with a thermos of coffee strapped to his saddlebag. Another closed his repair shop early in Knoxville and taped a note to the door: "Family emergency, back tomorrow." A Vietnam veteran in northern Georgia stood in his garage for 10 minutes staring at his vest before putting it on with shaking hands. A widower outside Nashville packed a bundle of white roses because his own wife had loved them. Men who had sworn they were too old for cold night rides kicked their engines alive anyway. They did not know Arthur Brennan, but they knew what it meant to be forgotten. And by midnight, Reaper's phone showed 212 confirmed riders. By 2 in the morning, it was over 300. By dawn, the number no longer mattered, because the road to Pinewood had begun to thunder. At 5:12 the next morning, Pinewood, Tennessee was still asleep. The town always woke slowly in November. The bakery lights usually came on around 6. The gas station owner unlocked his doors at 6:30. Farmers headed toward fields before sunrise, and retirees gathered at Rusty's Diner shortly after 7 to complain about weather forecasts and football rankings. But this morning was different. Long before the first alarm clock rang inside Pinewood, headlights were already moving through the darkness from every direction. They came from Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina. Some riders had been on the road all night. Others had slept for only 2 hours before climbing out of bed and pulling on old leather vests that carried decades of memories in every crease. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Fog rolled across the valleys. The roads shimmered with moisture. Yet motorcycles kept coming. Because once a call like that spread through the biker world, distance stopped mattering. And because every single man riding toward Pinewood carried a memory he rarely spoke about. A father, a brother, a wife, a son, a friend, someone buried with too few people standing around the grave, someone whose absence still hurt years later. For many of them, Arthur Brennan had already stopped being a stranger. He had become a symbol, a reminder. A debt they could never repay elsewhere. Reaper had slept exactly 1 hour. He spent the rest of the night sitting outside the small roadside motel where he and the others had rented rooms. The parking lot was quiet except for the occasional truck passing on the highway. He sat on a wooden bench beneath a flickering light, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold long before midnight. His phone never stopped buzzing. At one point, he muted it. 15 minutes later, he turned the sound back on. Not because he needed updates, because every vibration reminded him that people still cared. And lately, that felt important. At 3:47 a.m., a message arrived from a writer named Mason Ghost Keller. Ghost was 73 years old, former Marine, former chapter president, one of the hardest men Reaper had ever known. The message contained only one sentence. "My wife died in 2018. 4 people came. I'll be there." Reaper stared at the screen for a long time after reading it. Then another arrived. "Lost my father in 2002. Cemetery worker made a bigger crowd than family. Rolling now." Another. "Never met Arthur. Doesn't matter." Another. "Nobody leaves alone." Another. "Already on the highway." Around 4:30, Reaper finally stood and stretched his back. His knees cracked. His shoulders ached. His hands hurt from the cold. Getting old wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 tiny reminders every morning, a new ache, a slower step, a longer pause before standing. But this morning felt lighter somehow. Purpose had a way of masking pain. Inside a small white house on the opposite side of town, Dorothy Brennan had not slept much either. She spent most of the night moving quietly from room to room, not cleaning, not organizing, simply touching things. Arthur's chair, Arthur's toolbox, Arthur's fishing hat hanging beside the laundry room door. People always talked about grief as if it arrived like a storm, violent, sudden, overwhelming. Dorothy had learned something different. The real pain came afterward. The silence, the spaces, the ordinary moments that suddenly had nowhere to go. At 6 o'clock, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, fastening a small pearl necklace Arthur had given her on their 40th anniversary. Her hands trembled, not from age, from exhaustion. She had cried so much during the previous 4 days that even her tears seemed tired. The black dress hung neatly against her thin frame. Arthur always liked that dress. He used to tell her she looked beautiful in black because it made her eyes brighter. She smiled faintly at the memory, then immediately began crying again. "Not today," she whispered to herself. Her reflection looked unconvinced. Across town, Sheriff Dale Hargrove arrived at his office before sunrise. The parking lot was empty. The station smelled like old coffee and paper. He switched on the lights and immediately noticed 6 voice messages waiting on his desk phone. All of them concerned motorcycles. By the time he finished listening, the number of expected riders had somehow grown from 50 to 300. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Lord help me." His deputy entered moments later carrying coffee. "You hear?" "I heard. What do you think?" Hargrove looked out the window. "I think Arthur Brennan fixed my mother's porch for free after my father died." The deputy waited. The sheriff continued. "I think he taught Sunday school longer than you've been alive." Still waiting. "And I think if 300 bikers care more about his funeral than this town does, that's not their embarrassment." The deputy nodded slowly. Traffic duty suddenly felt less important. At 7:15 a.m., Pinewood began noticing. The first motorcycles appeared at a gas station on Route 14, 5 bikes, then 10, then 20. The cashier called her manager. The manager walked outside. The riders were polite, quiet, respectful. They bought coffee, filled tanks, thanked employees, then left, heading toward town. By 8 o'clock, another group arrived, then another, then another. Soon, the station looked like a motorcycle rally. Except nobody was laughing, nobody was drinking, nobody was celebrating. Something about the atmosphere felt different, heavier, purposeful. The riders spoke quietly. Many carried flowers strapped to saddlebags. Some wore black ribbons. Several had small American flags attached to their bikes. People began taking pictures, posting online, calling friends. Rumors spread faster than facts. By 8:30, residents lined the sidewalks, not because they were afraid anymore, because they wanted to see. At Pinewood Chapel, Pastor Michael Reed stood near the entrance staring down the road. 34 years old, recently assigned, still new enough to second-guess himself constantly. The previous evening, someone had informed him that a few bikers might attend the service. He expected 10, maybe 15. Now he wasn't sure. The funeral director walked beside him. "See anything?" The pastor squinted. At first he thought it was fog. Then he realized it was movement. Headlights, dozens of them, far away, cresting a hill. Then more appeared, then more, then more. The funeral director slowly lowered his coffee cup. "Oh," Pastor Reed swallowed. "Oh." Neither man spoke for several seconds. The line of motorcycles continued growing. It stretched across the road like a river of chrome and headlights, and it was getting bigger every minute. Meanwhile, Dorothy's funeral car turned onto County Road 9. She sat quietly in the back seat, hands folded, eyes red, heart heavy. The driver occasionally glanced into the mirror. He had seen something strange near the chapel, but he wasn't quite sure how to explain it. They rounded a curve. The driver slowed, then slowed again, then nearly stopped. Dorothy looked up. "Is everything all right?" The driver didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Ma'am?" His voice sounded different. "What is it?" The car crawled forward. Dorothy leaned slightly toward the window. At first she didn't understand what she was seeing. The road was lined with motorcycles, hundreds of them, rows and rows stretching farther than she could see. Chrome flashing beneath the morning sun, black leather, flowers, American flags, men standing silently beside their bikes, waiting. The funeral car moved closer. And then something happened that Dorothy Brennan would remember for the rest of her life. Every single rider removed his helmet. At the exact same moment, hundreds of heads bowed. No words, no engines, no noise, only respect. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. Her entire body froze. The driver quietly wiped one eye. Neither of them spoke. Because some moments are too large for language, and as the funeral car continued toward Pinewood Chapel, Dorothy finally understood. Reaper had kept his promise, but she still had no idea how many people had come, or why one face among the crowd was about to change everything. The funeral car rolled forward at little more than walking speed. Dorothy could barely breathe. The world outside the window no longer looked real. Everywhere she looked, there were motorcycles, not dozens, not even hundreds she could immediately count. Just an endless sea of chrome, black leather, weathered faces, and bowed heads stretching down both sides of County Road 9. The line disappeared around curves. It vanished behind trees. It filled parking areas, shoulders, side roads, and grassy fields. Some bikes looked brand new. Others looked older than many of the men riding them. There were Harleys that had crossed half the country, old touring bikes with faded paint, machines patched together by mechanics who refused to let them die. Each one represented miles, stories, losses, lives, and somehow all of them had converged here. For Arthur, a man they had never met. Dorothy pressed trembling fingers against the glass. Tears blurred everything. The driver quietly slowed even further. Neither wanted the moment to end. As the funeral car continued forward, riders remained motionless. No shouting, no revving engines, no attention-seeking displays, only silence. The kind of silence that feels sacred, the kind earned through respect. And for the first time since Arthur died, Dorothy no longer felt alone. Near the chapel entrance, Reaper stood waiting. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds. Thin beams of gold filtered across the cemetery hill. Cold air drifted through the trees. The scent of damp earth filled the air. Reaper watched the approaching car with his hands folded in front of him. Around him stood hundreds of riders. Yet nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They all understood why they were there. Kane stepped beside him. "You see her?" Reaper nodded. "She's crying." "Good." Kane looked at him. "Good?" Reaper kept watching the vehicle. "Better to cry because you're surprised by kindness than because you're alone." Kane didn't answer, because there wasn't much to add to that. The funeral car finally stopped. The driver exited first, walked around, opened the rear door. For several seconds, Dorothy remained seated, overwhelmed, frozen, trying to process something her mind simply wasn't prepared to understand. Then she looked up and saw Reaper standing there, waiting, exactly where he promised he'd be. The massive biker stepped forward, offered his hand. His expression carried none of the intimidation people usually associated with him. Only kindness, simple, quiet, steady kindness. "Morning, Mrs. Brennan." Dorothy looked at him, then looked behind him, at the hundreds of riders, then farther, at the hundreds more. Her lips trembled. "You came," Reaper smiled gently. "Told you I would." "No," a tear rolled down her cheek. "I mean all of you." For the first time all morning, Reaper glanced behind himself. Rows upon rows of bikers filled the road. Some older than him, some younger, some veterans, some fathers, some grandfathers, all standing together. He looked back at Dorothy. "Yeah," his voice softened. "Looks like they did." Dorothy began crying openly. Not the quiet crying of grief, not the exhausted tears she'd shed all week. This was different. This was relief, pure relief, the kind that comes when a burden you've carried alone suddenly becomes lighter. She reached for Reaper's hand, held it tightly, and whispered, Arthur would never believe this. Reaper looked toward the chapel. You'd be surprised what people believe when they're loved. As Dorothy entered the chapel, something remarkable happened. The riders did not rush inside. They did not compete for seats. Instead, they stepped aside, creating a path, allowing her to walk first, allowing her husband to remain the center of the day, exactly as it should be. Pastor Reed watched in amazement. The same pastor who expected a nearly empty service now found himself directing traffic. Volunteers opened additional rooms, extra chairs appeared, people stood along walls, hallways filled, the fellowship room filled, the chapel reached capacity within minutes, then exceeded it. More riders stood outside listening through open windows, others remained near the cemetery. Nobody complained, nobody left, because they had not traveled here for comfort. They came for Arthur. Inside the sanctuary, Dorothy sat in the front pew. Arthur's closed casket rested before the altar. White flowers surrounded it. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. For several moments she simply stared, trying to reconcile the image in front of her. 3 days ago she had feared emptiness. Now there wasn't a single empty seat, not one. The room was packed with strangers, yet somehow it felt like family. Pastor Reed stepped to the pulpit. He cleared his throat, then paused. His prepared speech suddenly felt inadequate. He looked across the crowd, rows of riders, weathered faces, scarred hands, tearful eyes, men who looked like they belonged in action movies or police reports. Yet many were visibly emotional. One elderly rider held a folded handkerchief. Another stared at the casket as if remembering someone else. A third quietly rubbed his wedding ring. The pastor realized something important. Almost everyone in that room had lost somebody. That was why they understood. That was why they came. Good morning, he began softly. We are gathered today to celebrate the life of Arthur James Brennan. The room fell completely silent, not because anyone demanded it, because everyone wanted to hear, every word, every memory, every detail. The pastor continued. Arthur was born in 1937, and slowly, gently, the story of Arthur Brennan began unfolding. His childhood, his military service, his carpentry business, his marriage, his church work, his kindness. The years passed through the pastor's words, decades compressed into memories, laughter, hardship, faith, family, love. Several times Dorothy found herself smiling through tears because she remembered, because every story brought Arthur back for a moment, not as a patient, not as a funeral, but as the man she had spent 63 years loving. Then, Pastor Reed reached the end of his prepared notes. He looked down, closed the folder, and hesitated. Normally, this would be the final prayer. The service would continue. People would leave. But today felt different. So he stepped away from the podium, looked across the room, and said something unexpected. If anyone would like to share a memory. He paused. You are welcome. At first, nobody moved. Then Dorothy slowly stood. The room immediately became still. Reaper rose beside her instinctively, offering support. She accepted. Together they walked toward the front. The widow stopped beside Arthur's casket, looked at the crowd, at the hundreds of strangers, and tried to speak. The first attempt failed. Emotion closed her throat. She tried again. My husband, she stopped. A tear rolled down her cheek. The room waited patiently. No rush, no pressure. Finally, she managed a smile. My husband would have hated all this attention. A ripple of gentle laughter spread through the chapel. Even Reaper smiled. Dorothy nodded. That's true. Another small laugh. Then her expression softened. But he would have loved all of you. Silence returned. He spent his entire life helping people. She looked toward the casket, not because he wanted recognition. Her voice shook. He just believed if someone needed help and you could help them, then you should. Many heads nodded. Dorothy continued. When our son died, the room became even quieter. Arthur spent months checking on me every single day, even when he was hurting too. Her eyes filled again. He used to say something. She swallowed, then smiled. He used to say that nobody should carry heavy things alone. Reaper lowered his eyes, because suddenly he understood exactly why her words felt familiar. why this whole situation felt strangely personal, because that belief, that exact belief, was the same code many riders lived by. Different words, same meaning. Dorothy looked at the crowd again. I thought I failed him. Her voice broke. When I learned only 2 people were coming, several riders lowered their heads. I thought I failed the promise I made. She wiped her eyes, then looked directly at Reaper. But this man, the entire chapel turned toward him. And all of you, she paused, gave me something I can never repay. Tears flowed freely now. You made sure Arthur wasn't alone. The room remained silent. Many riders fought emotions of their own because they weren't thinking about Arthur anymore. They were thinking about their fathers, their wives, their brothers, the people they still missed. And in that moment, Arthur Brennan became all of them, a life worth honoring, a person worth remembering, a reason to show up. Dorothy stepped back from the microphone. The chapel erupted into the softest applause imaginable. Not celebration, respect, love, gratitude. And just as she turned toward her seat, an elderly rider standing near the back slowly raised his hand. Pastor? The room turned. The man looked to be at least 75. Weathered face, silver beard, old leather vest faded by decades of sun. His voice was rough. I'd like to say something. Nobody knew it yet, but what that rider was about to reveal would completely change how everyone understood Arthur Brennan, and it would leave Reaper staring at the casket in absolute disbelief. The rider who stood near the back of the chapel didn't look remarkable at first glance. In fact, most people would have walked past him without noticing. He was thin, older than most of the men around him. His shoulders sloped slightly from age. His beard was completely white. The leather vest hanging from his frame looked worn enough to belong in a museum. Yet something about him immediately changed the atmosphere, not because he was loud, because of the reaction he triggered. As soon as he stood, several older riders nearby straightened. A few nodded respectfully. One man actually removed his cap. Reaper noticed. So did Kane. So did Preacher. The rider walked slowly toward the front. Years seemed to cling to each step. When he finally reached the microphone, he looked first at Dorothy, then at Arthur's casket, then at the packed chapel. His eyes shimmered with emotion. My name is Ghost. His voice sounded like gravel dragged across concrete. I came down from Kentucky last night. He paused. About 4 hours away. The pastor nodded. Ghost continued. I never met Arthur Brennan. A few people exchanged glances. The room remained silent. But I think I knew the kind of man he was. He looked toward Dorothy. Because I knew another man exactly like him. Dorothy listened carefully. Ghost smiled faintly. My father. His voice softened. He wasn't rich. A few riders nodded. He wasn't famous. More nods. He never held public office. The room listened. But every time somebody needed help, Ghost swallowed. He showed up. The chapel grew quiet enough to hear breathing. When a widow needed her roof fixed, a pause. He showed up. When a neighbor's truck broke down, another pause. He showed up. When somebody needed food, Ghost looked down briefly. He showed up. His eyes glistened. The funny thing is, a weak smile crossed his face. Most people never notice men like that until they're gone. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away, because every person in the room had known someone like that. Ghost nodded toward Arthur's casket. I don't know what kind of carpenter he was. A faint chuckle. But judging by the crowd, his eyes swept the sanctuary. He built something bigger than houses. Silence. He built people. Several riders lowered their heads. Ghost took a shaky breath. My father died in 2018. His voice nearly cracked. 4 people came. The room froze. Reaper looked up sharply. He remembered the text message, the one from 4 o'clock in the morning. Ghost continued. I spent years being angry about that. His jaw tightened. Years. He looked toward Dorothy. But this morning, his voice softened. Watching all these people show up for Arthur. A tear escaped. I realized something. The room waited. My father wasn't buried alone. Ghost pointed gently toward the crowd. Not really. Nobody spoke. Every life touches other lives. His eyes moved across the room. You may never see all the people you've helped. Another pause. You may never know whose life you changed. Another. You may never hear the thank you. His gaze settled on Arthur's casket. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The silence felt almost physical now. Ghost stepped away from the microphone, then stopped, turned back, and added one final sentence. Men like Arthur are why the world doesn't completely fall apart. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the applause began. Soft, respectful, emotional. Dozens of writers wiped their eyes. Even Pastor Reed looked overwhelmed. Ghost returned to his seat. But before he sat down, something happened. A voice called out from halfway back. Wait. Everyone turned. A man near the center aisle had stood. Late 60s, broad shoulders, weathered face, military posture. He looked directly at Dorothy. Ma'am, his voice sounded uncertain, almost hesitant. Can I ask you something? Dorothy nodded. The man glanced toward Arthur's photograph beside the casket, then back to her. Did your husband ever own a motorcycle? The question surprised everyone, including Dorothy. For a moment she simply blinked. Then she smiled through tears. Yes. The writer froze. Dorothy continued. When he was young, she laughed softly. He loved motorcycles. Several writers exchanged glances. The man near the aisle stepped closer. What kind? Dorothy thought. Indian. The writer. What color? Dark blue. The room became noticeably still. The man looked stunned. Completely stunned, as if he'd just heard something impossible. Reaper watched carefully. Something was happening, something nobody expected. The writer slowly approached the front. Ma'am, his voice had changed. When exactly was this? Dorothy frowned slightly. Late 50s. The writer closed his eyes, just briefly, then opened them again. What county? Madison County. The man suddenly laughed, not because anything was funny, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. What is it? Pastor Reed asked. The writer looked around the room, then pointed toward Arthur's photograph. I know him. The entire chapel froze. Dorothy stared. What? I know him. The writer moved closer, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a memory. My God, his voice shook. My God, he looked directly at Dorothy. Your husband saved my life. Complete silence. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Dorothy's eyes widened. The writer nodded. I was 19. His voice grew distant, lost in the past. It was 1961. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every person in the room leaned forward. The writer pointed toward the photograph again. That man, his throat tightened, pulled me out of a wreck outside Jackson. The room erupted with confused murmurs. Reaper stood completely still. The writer continued. My motorcycle slid under a truck. He swallowed hard. I was trapped. Another pause. Everybody else stayed back. His eyes locked on Arthur's picture. Except him. Dorothy covered her mouth. The writer's voice cracked. He crawled underneath. Silence. He cut his arms open on twisted metal. Another pause. He ignored the gas leaking everywhere. Another. And he dragged me out before the whole thing caught fire. The room stared, completely captivated. The writer wiped one eye. I never forgot his face. He pointed toward the photo. Never. Dorothy was crying openly now. The writer smiled sadly. He stayed with me in the hospital. Another pause. Visited 3 times. Another. And when I asked how I could repay him, his voice softened. He told me to help somebody else someday. No one spoke, because there was nothing to say. The writer looked around the chapel, at the hundreds of bikers, at Dorothy, at Arthur's casket, then smiled through tears. I guess we're all here because he did. A wave of emotion swept through the sanctuary. Many writers openly cried now, even hardened men who had spent decades hiding their feelings, because suddenly Arthur Brennan wasn't simply a good husband, or a kind carpenter, or a respected church volunteer. He was something more. A man whose kindness had traveled across 60 years, a man whose single act had survived long enough to fill an entire chapel. And as Reaper stared at Arthur's photograph, another strange feeling crept into his chest. because for the second time that day, something about Arthur seemed familiar. Not the face, not the story, something else. A feeling, a memory sitting just beyond reach. And deep down, Reaper had the unsettling sense that the biggest revelation about Arthur Brennan had not happened yet. Not even close. The chapel should have felt crowded. By every practical measure, it was. More than 400 people had packed themselves into a building designed for less than 100. Riders stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Others filled the hallways. Several dozen remained outside beneath the oak trees, listening through open windows. Yet somehow, the room felt smaller now, more intimate, as if every person present had been drawn into the same memory. The rider who had been saved by Arthur returned quietly to his seat. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Dorothy sat beside the casket with both hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her tears had slowed, but her mind raced. For 63 years she had known Arthur Brennan, or at least she thought she had. She knew how he liked his coffee. She knew which side of the bed he slept on. She knew the sound he made when his knees hurt during winter. She knew he secretly hated mushrooms, but ate them anyway when she cooked them. She knew every birthday, every anniversary, every scar, every regret. Yet stories kept appearing from places she had never expected, lives he had touched, people he had helped, moments he had never mentioned. And for the first time, Dorothy realized something beautiful. Arthur hadn't hidden those stories. He simply never counted them. To him, helping people wasn't something worth talking about. It was simply what you did. Reaper remained standing near the back of the sanctuary. His attention drifted toward Arthur's photograph again. That strange feeling hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. The photograph showed Arthur in his 70s. Gray hair, gentle smile, kind eyes, nothing familiar. Yet something underneath kept pulling at him. A memory, a face, a voice, something. But every time he reached for it mentally, it slipped away. "You're doing it again." Kane appeared beside him. "What?" "Staring." Reaper folded his arms. "You don't find this strange?" Kane glanced toward the casket. "Which part?" "The feeling." Kane laughed softly. "That narrows it down." Reaper shook his head. "Never mind." But he couldn't shake it, because deep inside he had begun wondering whether fate was playing a game with him. Pastor Reed eventually stepped forward again. "Would anyone else like to speak?" Immediately 3 hands rose, then 4, then 6. The pastor blinked. Apparently, Arthur Brennan wasn't finished telling his story. The next speaker was a woman in her 60s. Nobody recognized her, not even Dorothy. The woman approached nervously, held the microphone, looked toward Arthur's photograph, then smiled. "My name is Linda Harper." Dorothy frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "I don't think Arthur would remember me." Linda laughed softly. "Actually, I'm certain he wouldn't." A few smiles appeared. Linda continued. "When I was 11 years old," her voice softened. "My bicycle chain snapped on the side of the road." Several people chuckled. "It doesn't sound important." She nodded. "It wasn't," then paused. "But I was crying." More smiles. "My father had just died." The room quieted immediately. Linda looked toward Dorothy. "I hadn't told anybody." Her eyes glistened. "Not even my teachers." A pause. "I sat beside the road crying over a stupid bicycle." Another pause. Arthur stopped his truck. Dorothy lowered her eyes. The story already sounded familiar. "He fixed the chain," Linda smiled. "Then he sat beside me for almost an hour." The room listened. "He didn't preach." A pause. "He didn't tell me everything would be okay." Another. "He just listened." Linda wiped away a tear. "Sometimes that's harder." The room remained silent. Afterward, he handed me $5. A soft laugh escaped her. $5 felt like $1 million in 1973. Several people smiled. Linda nodded toward the casket. "I never forgot that." Then she looked at Dorothy. "He probably forgot it before dinner." The room laughed gently. Because everyone was beginning to understand the pattern, Arthur helped, then moved on, never expecting recognition, never keeping score. Another person spoke, then another, then another. Stories emerged from every corner of the chapel: a farmer, a former student, a mechanic, a retired nurse. Each carried a memory. Each revealed another piece of Arthur. The picture became larger, richer, deeper. And with every story, the crowd grew more emotional. Because they weren't only hearing about Arthur anymore, they were hearing about goodness. The kind rarely shown on television, rarely celebrated, rarely rewarded. The kind that quietly changes lives anyway. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. Sheriff Dale Hargrove stood. The room immediately recognized him. The sheriff removed his hat, walked slowly to the front, and stopped beside Arthur's casket. His voice was rough from emotion before he even began. "Arthur embarrassed me once." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. The sheriff nodded. "Deservedly." A few chuckles. He smiled. "Back in 1989. The room listened. "My mother was living alone after my father passed." His expression softened. The front porch steps were falling apart. Dorothy remembered this story. Arthur had mentioned it years ago. Sheriff Hargrove continued. "I offered to pay him." A pause. He refused. Another. "I insisted." Another. "He refused again." The sheriff smiled. "Then I got irritated." Laughter. "So I asked him why." A pause. The sheriff looked toward Arthur's photograph. "You know what he said?" Nobody answered. "Because someday it'll be your turn to help somebody else." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I've carried that sentence for 35 years. Silence. "And today," his eyes moved across the riders filling the sanctuary. "I think I'm looking at the result." The room became still. Because he was right. Every person present represented that same philosophy. Different roads, different lives, same principle. Help somebody else, then keep moving. Outside, the crowd continued growing. More motorcycles arrived, even though the service had already begun. Late riders parked quietly, removed helmets, walked toward the chapel. Some stood beneath trees, others remained near the cemetery. Nobody wanted to interrupt, but nobody wanted to miss being there either. The line of motorcycles now stretched so far down County Road 9 that local residents were driving out simply to see it. Phones recorded videos, pictures spread online, people asked questions. Why would hundreds of bikers attend the funeral of an unknown carpenter? Nobody had a simple answer, because the real answer wasn't about Arthur anymore. It was about what Arthur represented. Inside the chapel, Reaper's phone vibrated. He almost ignored it, then glanced down. The message came from an unfamiliar number. No name attached, just a text. "Are you at Arthur Brennan's funeral?" Reaper frowned. A second message arrived immediately. "Need to speak with Thomas Vaughn. Urgent." His eyes narrowed. Very few people used his real name. Even fewer knew it. He looked around. The service continued. Nobody seemed connected to the message. Another text appeared. "You don't know me, but Arthur Brennan saved your life too." Reaper froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. For several seconds he simply stared at the screen, then read it again, and again. Kane noticed immediately. "What happened?" Reaper didn't answer. His pulse had accelerated. The strange feeling, the familiarity, the memory he couldn't reach. Suddenly it felt much closer, dangerously close. His phone buzzed again. A final message. "Check the inside pocket of Arthur's old riding jacket. Dorothy doesn't know what's inside." Reaper slowly lowered the phone. Every instinct he possessed suddenly came alive. Because something was wrong. Or maybe something was about to be revealed. And for the first time that day, he realized Arthur Brennan's story might be far bigger than anyone in that chapel understood, including Dorothy, including the sheriff, including the hundreds of riders who had crossed state lines to honor him, and especially including Reaper himself. Because somewhere in Arthur Brennan's past, there was a secret waiting to be uncovered. And it had Reaper's name written all over it. Reaper read the message 4 times, then a 5th. The words refused to make sense, or maybe they made too much sense. That was what unsettled him. His eyes remained fixed on the screen while the funeral service continued around him. The chapel felt distant suddenly. Voices blurred together. The crowd disappeared. Even Arthur's casket seemed farther away. All Reaper could see was one sentence. "Arthur Brennan saved your life too." Impossible. Or maybe not. That was the problem. Because the harder he tried to dismiss it, the stronger that strange feeling became. The familiarity, the memory sitting just out of reach, the sensation he'd been fighting all day, like seeing a face from childhood in a crowd but being unable to place it. Kane leaned closer. "You gonna tell me what's got you looking like you saw a ghost?" Reaper handed him the phone. Kane read the messages. His expression changed immediately. "What the hell?" "Exactly." Preacher glanced over. Bulldog, too. Within seconds, all three had seen the text. Nobody spoke, because nobody knew what to say. Finally, Preacher broke the silence. "You think it's a prank?" Reaper didn't answer immediately. "No." "Why not?" "Because whoever sent it knows my real name." That got their attention. Very few people knew Thomas Vaughn anymore. The road name had replaced the man decades ago. To most riders, police officers, bartenders, mechanics, and friends, he was simply Reaper. Only old records and older memories still used Thomas. The message felt personal, specific, targeted, and that bothered him. A lot. At the front of the chapel, another speaker finished sharing a story about Arthur helping rebuild a church playground after a storm. The crowd applauded softly. Pastor Reed smiled. People continued remembering, continued grieving, continued celebrating. Yet Reaper could no longer focus. His mind had started moving backward through time, years, decades, searching. Looking for connections, looking for answers. And then something surfaced, not a memory, a feeling, fear, old fear, the kind experienced by children. Suddenly he was 7 years old again, cold, lost, crying, standing beside a highway. The image flashed through his mind and vanished. Reaper blinked, his heartbeat accelerated, because that memory hadn't appeared in over 50 years. "What's wrong?" Kane asked quietly. Reaper stared toward Arthur's photograph. "I don't know." "You remember something?" "Maybe." The answer frustrated him, because it wasn't enough. Not yet. Another vibration, another text. Reaper immediately looked down. This time the message contained a name. "Call me after the service. Name's Walter Jenkins." Arthur asked me to keep something safe until after he was gone. A phone number followed. Nothing else, no explanation, no details, just more questions. For the first time all day, Reaper considered leaving the chapel, finding a quiet place, making the call immediately. But one look toward Dorothy stopped him. She sat beside Arthur's casket listening to story after story, laughing through tears, learning new things about her husband, experiencing something she would remember forever. No, the call could wait. Arthur had waited 60 years. Another hour wouldn't matter. Nearly 45 minutes later, the service finally began moving toward its conclusion. Pastor Reed returned to the pulpit. The chapel settled. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Dust floated in golden beams. Outside, wind moved softly through bare branches. Inside, hundreds of people listened. The pastor opened his Bible, read scripture, spoke about kindness, legacy, love. Then he looked toward the crowd. "I think everyone here understands something important today." His voice carried through the room. "Most people spend their lives worrying about what they'll leave behind." The audience listened. "Money?" A pause. "Property?" Another. "Achievements?" He glanced toward Arthur's casket. "But Arthur Brennan left something far more valuable." The room grew still. "He left evidence." Confused expressions appeared. The pastor smiled gently. "Evidence that kindness matters." Silence. "Evidence that ordinary people change lives." Another pause. "Evidence that goodness survives longer than we think." Many riders lowered their heads, because deep down they knew he was right. The final prayer ended. The congregation stood. The service was over. But nobody rushed toward the exits. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The atmosphere felt too meaningful, too important. People lingered, talked quietly, shared memories, embraced strangers. Dorothy remained near the casket, one hand resting lightly against the polished wood, as if saying goodbye one last time. Reaper watched from a distance, then something unexpected happened. Dorothy looked up, directly at him, and smiled, a genuine smile, small, tired, heartbroken, but real. For the first time since meeting her, he saw peace in her eyes. And somehow that mattered more than the crowd, more than the motorcycles, more than the attention, because this had never been about numbers. It had always been about one woman keeping a promise. The funeral director approached Dorothy quietly. "Mrs. Brennan," she turned. "Yes?" The man hesitated. "There's something we found." Dorothy frowned. "What do you mean?" The director looked uncomfortable. "One of Arthur's personal items." Reaper's attention sharpened immediately. The funeral director continued. "We discovered it while preparing his belongings." Dorothy seemed confused. "What is it?" "A jacket." The room around them suddenly felt smaller. The director looked toward a side office. "An old riding jacket." Reaper froze. Kane noticed. Preacher noticed. Bulldog noticed. Every one of them remembered the text. "Check the inside pocket of Arthur's old riding jacket." Dorothy blinked. "Arthur's motorcycle jacket?" "Yes, ma'am." Her expression softened immediately. "I haven't seen that thing in years." The director nodded. "He kept it in storage." A pause. "There appears to be something inside." Reaper's pulse jumped. The funeral director looked uncertain. "We didn't feel comfortable opening it." Dorothy frowned. "Why?" The director hesitated, then answered. "Because it appears to be addressed to someone." Silence. Complete silence. Dorothy stared. The director continued. "A sealed envelope." Another pause. "With a name written on the front." Reaper already knew. Somehow he already knew. Before the words left the man's mouth, before anyone looked at him, before reality caught up, he knew. The funeral director glanced around the chapel, then read aloud. "Thomas Vaughn." The room fell silent. Every rider turned. Every eye found Reaper. Dorothy looked confused. Kane looked stunned. Preacher stopped breathing for a second, and Reaper felt something inside him shift. Because suddenly, that distant childhood memory wasn't distant anymore. It was coming back, fast, and whatever waited inside that envelope was about to connect Arthur Brennan to Thomas Vaughn in a way nobody could have imagined, including Arthur's own widow. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed willing to breathe. The funeral director still held the old envelope in both hands. The room remained frozen around a single name. Thomas Vaughn. Not Reaper. Not the road name that hundreds of riders knew. Not the name printed on club records. Not the name spoken across decades of highways. His real name. The one almost nobody used anymore. The one buried beneath 50 years of leather, scars, and road miles. Reaper stared at the envelope. His stomach tightened, because suddenly this no longer felt like coincidence, not even close. Dorothy looked from the envelope to Reaper, then back again. Confusion covered her face. "I'm sorry." Her voice sounded small. "You said your name was Thomas?" Reaper nodded slowly. "Long time ago." The funeral director carefully stepped forward, holding the envelope out. The paper was yellowed with age, fold marks softened by time. The handwriting looked familiar somehow, strong, neat, deliberate, a working man's handwriting, the kind taught before computers existed, the kind Arthur would have used. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, "For Thomas Vaughn, if you're still alive." A murmur passed through the chapel. Even Kane looked stunned. "What the hell?" Preacher whispered. Bulldog simply stared. Reaper reached out slowly, took the envelope. His large, scarred hands suddenly felt strangely unsteady. Dorothy stepped closer. "How would Arthur know you?" Reaper looked at her, then at the envelope, then back at her. "I don't know." But even as he said it, the answer felt less true than before, because the memory kept growing, getting stronger, closer. A highway, rain, fear, a motorcycle, a voice. Pieces. Only pieces, yet enough to make his pulse pound. The funeral director cleared his throat. "You should probably open it." Nobody disagreed. 400 people stood silent, watching, waiting. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Reaper carefully broke the seal. The paper crackled softly. Inside was a folded letter. And something else. A photograph. Old, black and white, edges worn. Reaper unfolded the photograph first, then froze, completely froze. The picture showed a motorcycle, an old Indian, dark-colored, late 1950s. Beside it stood a young man. Arthur, There was no question. Even decades younger, the face was unmistakable. But Arthur wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a little boy, 7 years old, thin, dark hair, frightened eyes. The child held Arthur's hand. The entire chapel watched as color drained from Reaper's face because he recognized the boy instantly. It was him. Kane took one step forward. "What is it?" Reaper couldn't answer. The photograph trembled slightly in his fingers. His mind had stopped hearing the room, stopped hearing voices, stopped hearing anything except the memory finally breaking open. And suddenly, he remembered. Everything. September. Heavy rain, a roadside diner, a truck stop, his mother crying, his father gone. Again. The arguments had become constant by then. The drinking, the disappearing, the promises never kept. Thomas Vaughn was 7 years old, and angry. Angrier than a child should know how to be. That afternoon, he had run away. Not far, just far enough. Or so he thought. But storms don't care what children think. The rain came fast, hard, relentless. He got lost. The highway stretched endlessly. Cars rushed past. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked. A scared little boy stood alone beside the road, cold, wet, terrified. Hours passed. Darkness approached, and then a motorcycle appeared. Reaper closed his eyes. The memory hit him with full force. A dark motorcycle pulling onto the shoulder, an engine shutting down, boots hitting pavement, a young man removing his helmet, kneeling, smiling, not demanding, not threatening, not angry, just kind. The man had asked one question. "You all right, buddy?" Reaper's throat tightened, because he remembered the voice. After 60 years, he remembered the voice. The chapel remained silent. Everyone watched. Nobody understood yet. But they knew something enormous was happening. Dorothy looked frightened now. "Thomas?" Her voice trembled. "What is it?" Reaper opened his eyes. Tears filled them. Real tears. The kind nobody in that room had ever seen from him. Not Kane, not Preacher, not Bulldog, nobody. He looked directly at Dorothy, then toward Arthur's casket, and finally managed to speak. "Your husband." His voice broke. The room froze. "Your husband found me." Silence. "He found me when I was 7 years old." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Dorothy covered her mouth. Reaper continued. "He got me off that highway." His eyes remained locked on Arthur's photograph. "He bought me dinner." A pause. "He called the sheriff." Another. "He stayed with me until my mother arrived." Tears rolled down his face. "He stayed the entire night." The room stood perfectly still, because suddenly the impossible connection made sense. The feeling, the familiarity, the memory. Arthur Brennan wasn't a stranger, not really. He had been part of Thomas Vaughn's life long before Reaper existed. Dorothy began crying again, harder than before, because now she understood something too. Arthur had never told her this story, not once, not in 63 years, not because it wasn't important, because helping people wasn't something he collected. It was simply who he was. The rider saved from the motorcycle crash wiped his eyes. Ghost lowered his head. Even Sheriff Hargrove looked overwhelmed. The room felt emotional before. Now it felt shattered in the best possible way. Reaper looked down at the letter. There was still more, much more. The handwritten pages waited in his hands. Arthur's final words, words written before his death, words addressed to a boy he helped 6 decades earlier, a boy who grew into the old biker standing beside his coffin. Slowly, very slowly, Reaper unfolded the letter. And when he saw the first line, his knees nearly gave out, because Arthur Brennan had known exactly who he was, for years, and had been secretly watching his life from a distance without ever revealing himself. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed willing to breathe. The funeral director still held the old envelope in both hands. The room remained frozen around a single name. Thomas Vaughn. Not Reaper, not the road name that hundreds of riders knew, not the name printed on club records, not the name spoken across decades of highways. His real name. The one almost nobody used anymore. The one buried beneath 50 years of leather, scars, and road miles. Reaper stared at the envelope. His stomach tightened, because suddenly this no longer felt like coincidence, not even close. Dorothy looked from the envelope to Reaper, then back again. Confusion covered her face. "I'm sorry." Her voice sounded small. "You said your name was Thomas?" Reaper nodded slowly. "Long time ago." The funeral director carefully stepped forward, holding the envelope out. The paper was yellowed with age, fold marks softened by time. The handwriting looked familiar somehow, strong, neat, deliberate, a working man's handwriting, the kind taught before computers existed, the kind Arthur would have used. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, "For Thomas Vaughn, if you're still alive." A murmur passed through the chapel. Even Cain looked stunned. "What the hell?" Preacher whispered. Bulldog simply stared. Reaper reached out slowly, took the envelope. His large, scarred hands suddenly felt strangely unsteady. Dorothy stepped closer. "How would Arthur know you?" Reaper looked at her, then at the envelope, then back at her. "I don't know," but even as he said it, the answer felt less true than before, because the memory kept growing, getting stronger, closer, a highway, rain, fear, a motorcycle, a voice, pieces, only pieces, yet enough to make his pulse pound. The funeral director cleared his throat. "You should probably open it." Nobody disagreed. 400 people stood silent, watching, waiting. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Reaper carefully broke the seal. The paper crackled softly. Inside was a folded letter, and something else. A photograph. Old, black and white, edges worn. Reaper unfolded the photograph first, then froze. Completely froze. The picture showed a motorcycle, an old Indian, dark-colored, late 1950s. Beside it stood a young man, Arthur. There was no question. Even decades younger, the face was unmistakable. But Arthur wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a little boy, 7 years old, thin, dark hair, frightened eyes. The child held Arthur's hand. The entire chapel watched as color drained from Reaper's face, because he recognized the boy instantly. It was him. Cain took one step forward. "What is it?" Reaper couldn't answer. The photograph trembled slightly in his fingers. His mind had stopped hearing the room, stopped hearing voices, stopped hearing anything except the memory finally breaking open. And suddenly, he remembered. Everything. September, heavy rain, a roadside diner, a truck stop, his mother crying, his father gone. Again. The arguments had become constant by then. The drinking, the disappearing, the promises never kept. Thomas Vaughn was 7 years old, and angry. Angrier than a child should know how to be. That afternoon he had run away, not far, just far enough, or so he thought. But storms don't care what children think. The rain came fast, hard, relentless. He got lost. The highway stretched endlessly. Cars rushed past. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked. A scared little boy stood alone beside the road, cold, wet, terrified. Hours passed. Darkness approached, and then a motorcycle appeared. Reaper closed his eyes. The memory hit him with full force. A dark motorcycle pulling onto the shoulder, an engine shutting down, boots hitting pavement, a young man removing his helmet, kneeling, smiling, not demanding, not threatening, not angry, just kind. The man had asked one question. "You all right, buddy?" Reaper's throat tightened, because he remembered the voice. After 60 years, he remembered the voice. The chapel remained silent. Everyone watched. Nobody understood yet, but they knew something enormous was happening. Dorothy looked frightened now. "Thomas?" Her voice trembled. "What is it?" Reaper opened his eyes. Tears filled them, real tears. The kind nobody in that room had ever seen from him. Not Cain, not Preacher, not Bulldog. Nobody. He looked directly at Dorothy, then toward Arthur's casket, and finally managed to speak. "Your husband." His voice broke. The room froze. "Your husband found me." Silence. "He found me when I was 7 years old." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Dorothy covered her mouth. Reaper continued. "He got me off that highway." His eyes remained locked on Arthur's photograph. "He bought me dinner." A pause. "He called the sheriff." Another. "He stayed with me until my mother arrived." Tears rolled down his face. "He stayed the entire night." The room stood perfectly still, because suddenly the impossible connection made sense. The feeling, the familiarity, the memory. Arthur Brennan wasn't a stranger. Not really. He had been part of Thomas Vaughn's life long before Reaper existed. Dorothy began crying again, harder than before, because now she understood something too. Arthur had never told her this story, not once, not in 63 years, not because it wasn't important, because helping people wasn't something he collected. It was simply who he was. The rider saved from the motorcycle crash wiped his eyes. Ghost lowered his head. Even Sheriff Hargrove looked overwhelmed. The room felt emotional before. Now it felt shattered in the best possible way. Reaper looked down at the letter. There was still more. Much more. The handwritten pages waited in his hands. Arthur's final words, words written before his death, words addressed to a boy he helped 6 decades earlier, a boy who grew into the old biker standing beside his coffin. Slowly, very slowly, Reaper unfolded the letter, and when he saw the first line, his knees nearly gave out, because Arthur Brennan had known exactly who he was, for years, and had been secretly watching his life from a distance, without ever revealing himself. The chapel had become so quiet that the faint creaking of the old wooden beams overhead sounded loud. No one shifted in their seat. No one checked a phone. No one whispered. More than 400 people sat frozen in place, watching a man everyone thought they understood slowly unfold a letter from another man they had never truly known. Reaper stared at the page, his vision blurred, not because the handwriting was difficult to read, because tears kept filling his eyes. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. Arthur Brennan's handwriting covered both sides, neat, careful, deliberate. Every line looked as though he had taken his time, as though he knew exactly what he wanted to say, as though he had been waiting years to say it. Reaper swallowed hard, then began reading aloud. Thomas, if you're reading this, then Dorothy finally found the jacket, which means I probably ran out of time before I could tell you this myself. The room remained silent. Reaper continued. You probably don't remember me right away. I wouldn't blame you. You were just a little boy standing beside Highway 25 in the rain. Scared half to death? Hungry? Angry? Trying very hard not to cry. A few riders exchanged glances. Reaper's jaw tightened because every word was true. Every single one. But I remember you. I remembered you for 60 years. Dorothy lowered her head. A fresh wave of tears rolled down her cheeks. The room listened, completely absorbed. Most people think they remember important days. Weddings, births, promotions, big victories. But I've learned something different. The days you remember forever are usually the days you almost lose somebody. Reaper stopped briefly. His throat tightened. He looked at Arthur's casket, then continued. When I found you that afternoon, you reminded me of someone. My younger brother. He died before he reached 10. Fever took him. Back then there wasn't much doctors could do. When I saw you standing there beside that road, for 1 second, I thought I was looking at him again. A collective breath moved through the room. Arthur had never told Dorothy this, not once. She stared at the letter, completely stunned, because after 63 years of marriage, she was still learning new things about her husband. You wouldn't get on the motorcycle at first. Remember that? A few riders smiled softly. Reaper actually laughed through his tears, because now he remembered. Perfectly. You told me your mother said never trust strangers. Smart woman. I told you she was right. Then I bought you a hamburger and waited until you trusted me anyway. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the chapel. Even Dorothy smiled. Reaper wiped his eyes. The memory had returned completely now. The diner, the food, the motorcycle, the long wait, Arthur talking about baseball just to keep a frightened child calm. A memory buried beneath 6 decades of life. Suddenly alive again. Then Reaper reached the next paragraph, and everything changed. His smile disappeared. The room became still again. The reason I'm writing this isn't because I saved you. Truth is, Thomas, you saved me too. Confused looks appeared throughout the chapel. Reaper frowned, then kept reading. You showed up at a difficult time in my life. I never told Dorothy how bad things got back then. I was drinking too much. working too much, losing faith in people, losing faith in myself. The day I found you, I'd spent most of the morning wondering if anything I did mattered anymore. The room grew perfectly silent, because suddenly Arthur wasn't just the hero of the story. He was human, broken, struggling, lost, just like everyone else. Then I found a scared little boy standing in the rain. And for a few hours, nothing else mattered. Helping you reminded me of the kind of man I wanted to be. The kind of man I almost stopped being. Dorothy closed her eyes, because she knew exactly when Arthur had been talking about. The early years, the difficult years, the years they rarely discussed, the years before everything improved, before children, before stability, before peace. A funny thing happened after that day. Every time I wanted to become selfish, I remembered you. Every time I wanted to stop caring, I remembered you. Every time life convinced me people weren't worth helping, I remembered a scared little boy standing beside a highway. The chapel felt emotional before. Now people openly cried, not because the story was sad, because it was true, because everyone understood it. One small act, one random encounter, one ordinary moment, changing 2 lives for 60 years. Reaper turned the page. There was more, much more. And then he reached a section that made his heart stop. You probably don't know this, but I've followed your life from a distance. The room froze. Every writer looked up. Reaper stared. Arthur had been watching? How? Why? Not in a creepy way. Relax. The entire chapel unexpectedly laughed, even through tears, even from inside a funeral. Arthur's humor somehow survived the grave. I saw your picture in a newspaper years later. Motorcycle charity ride. Then another article. Then another. Fundraisers. Veteran support programs. Children's hospital donations. Toy drives. Several writers lowered their heads, because those things were real. The public rarely saw them. The media rarely reported them. But they happened, year after year, quietly, consistently. Every time I saw your name, I smiled, because I realized something. The frightened little boy grew into a man who spent his life helping other people. Reaper looked down, unable to hide his emotion. Arthur had known, all along. He had known. That's when I understood something important. Kindness doesn't stop where you expect it to. It keeps traveling. Sometimes for years. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes longer than we're alive to witness. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room had become completely absorbed. Arthur was speaking to all of them now, not just Reaper, everyone. Then Reaper reached the final page, and the last paragraph, the one Arthur had saved for the end, the one that would completely break the room. Thomas, if somehow you're reading this after I'm gone, I need one favor. Just one. Reaper's voice shook. Take care of Dorothy. The room fell silent, utterly silent. She'll tell you she's fine. She'll insist she's fine. She's stubborn that way. Don't believe her. A few people laughed softly through tears. Dorothy buried her face in her hands because it was true. Completely true. She's taken care of me for 63 years. Now somebody needs to take care of her. Reaper stopped reading, couldn't continue. His voice failed, the words blurred, his hands trembled. For several seconds the room waited. Then he forced himself onward. I trusted you when you were 7. I trust you now. Don't let her be alone. The final line sat at the bottom of the page, short, simple, devastating. Thank you for proving that helping one person can change the world. Your friend, Arthur Brennan. Reaper lowered the letter, and for the first time in decades, the old biker openly cried. Not quietly, not secretly, not hiding it, because some moments are too important for pride, and all around him, hundreds of riders cried too, while Dorothy Brennan looked at the man Arthur had saved 60 years ago and realized her husband had just given her a new family. For a long time after Reaper finished reading the letter, nobody moved. Nobody seemed capable of it. The old biker stood beside Arthur Brennan's casket, holding the folded pages in one hand, while tears rolled freely through his gray beard. Across the sanctuary, hardened men who had survived wars, prison sentences, divorces, cancer diagnoses, and motorcycle crashes sat quietly wiping their eyes. No one was embarrassed. No one looked away, because everyone understood something profound had just happened. Arthur Brennan had somehow managed to speak to all of them after death, and somehow, impossibly, he'd done it without making the story about himself. Dorothy remained seated in the front pew. Her hands covered her mouth. The tears wouldn't stop, but neither would the smile. For the first time since Arthur died, she felt him everywhere, not as a memory, not as an absence, as a presence in the stories, in the crowd, in the letter, in the hundreds of people filling the chapel because of choices he had made decades earlier. The realization overwhelmed her. Arthur hadn't disappeared. His kindness was still moving, still growing, still changing lives, even now. Pastor Reed finally stepped forward. His eyes were red, his voice unsteady. "I've conducted funerals for 12 years. The room listened. "I've buried soldiers." A pause. "Teachers." Another. "Business owners." Another. "Children." Silence. "But I've never witnessed anything like this." His eyes moved across the sanctuary. Not once, nobody spoke, because nobody disagreed. Then the pastor looked toward Arthur's casket and smiled. "I think Mr. Brennan just delivered his own eulogy." A wave of gentle laughter moved through the room. The first genuine laughter all day, the kind that comes from love, not humor. The service ended shortly afterward, but once again, nobody rushed to leave. Groups formed throughout the chapel, stories continued. People introduced themselves. Riders from different states shook hands. Neighbors met bikers. Bikers met church members. Complete strangers embraced. Arthur Brennan had somehow turned a funeral into a family reunion for people who had never met. Outside, the November sun sat higher in the sky. The cemetery overlooked rolling Tennessee hills painted in gold and brown. The air remained cold, but the clouds had disappeared, almost as if the weather itself had decided to cooperate. The funeral procession slowly formed near the chapel entrance, and that was when Pinewood truly understood what had happened. Because the line of motorcycles hadn't gotten smaller, it had gotten larger, far larger. Throughout the service, riders kept arriving. Word had continued spreading. Friends told friends, brothers told brothers. People changed plans, skipped work, turned around on highways, joined the ride. By the time Arthur's casket emerged from the chapel, there were nearly 600 motorcycles lining the roads surrounding Pinewood. 600. For a carpenter, for a husband, for a man most of them had never met. Residents filled sidewalks. Store owners stood outside their businesses. Children sat on shoulders. Elderly couples leaned against fences. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. Not in Pinewood, not anywhere nearby. Phones recorded everything, but many eventually lowered them. Because some moments feel wrong to watch through a screen. Arthur's casket was carried carefully toward the hearse. The honor guard moved slowly, respectfully, deliberately. As they passed, every rider removed his helmet, again, without instruction, without coordination, without anyone needing to ask. The sight left many townspeople speechless. Sheriff Hargrove stood near the road directing traffic. At one point, his deputy approached him. The younger officer looked overwhelmed. "Sir," Hargrove never looked away from the procession. "Yeah? I've never seen anything like this." The sheriff nodded. "Neither have I." The deputy hesitated. "Why would all these people come?" Hargrove watched Arthur's casket enter the hearse, then smiled faintly. "Because good men leave footprints." The deputy followed his gaze. The sheriff continued. "Most people just don't realize how far they go." The procession began moving, slowly, respectfully. The hearse led. Behind it came Dorothy's vehicle. Behind Dorothy came Reaper, then Cain, then Preacher, then Bulldog, then hundreds more. The sound was unforgettable, not loud, not aggressive, steady, deep, a low rolling thunder stretching for miles, the heartbeat of 600 motorcycles honoring one man. As they climbed the hill toward the cemetery, Dorothy looked out her window. She kept seeing faces, different ages, different lives, yet all united by one simple choice: to show up. Exactly as Arthur would have, Her hand drifted toward the folded letter resting in her lap, Arthur's final gift, not to Reaper, not really, to both of them. The cemetery appeared ahead. Rows of headstones stretched across the hillside. The grass shimmered beneath the autumn sun. Leaves drifted lazily through the air. And waiting near the gravesite was another surprise. A small group of elderly men, 7 of them, standing together. All wearing matching blue caps, all in their 80s, all visibly nervous. Dorothy frowned. She didn't recognize them immediately. Then one stepped forward, and her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," the man smiled. "Hello, Dorothy." Her hand flew to her mouth, because standing before her were Arthur's childhood friends, the ones everyone thought were too old, too sick, too far away, the ones she believed couldn't make the trip. Yet, somehow, they had. Every single one. Later she would learn what happened. A writer from Nashville had heard Arthur's story, tracked down one friend. That friend contacted another, then another, then another. Within hours, transportation had been arranged, drivers volunteered, wheelchairs borrowed, medical equipment loaded, and 7 elderly men who hadn't been together in years suddenly found themselves standing beside Arthur's grave, waiting. Dorothy broke down completely. The strongest emotional moment of the entire day, not because of the motorcycles, not because of the crowd, not because of the letter, because these men represented Arthur's entire life. His childhood, his youth, his memories, his history, and somehow they were here. One of the old men stepped forward, his voice shaky with age. "Couldn't let him leave without us." The sentence destroyed whatever emotional defenses remained. Around them, riders quietly lowered their heads. Many cried openly again, because they understood. Friendship like that was rare. Then the burial began. And just when everyone thought Arthur Brennan had delivered his final surprise, Reaper noticed something sticking out of the inside pocket of the old riding jacket. A second envelope, smaller, hidden deeper, missed by everyone, including the funeral director, including Dorothy, including Arthur himself perhaps, or perhaps not. Reaper carefully pulled it free, looked at the handwriting, and froze. Because unlike the first letter, this one wasn't addressed to Thomas Vaughn. It was addressed to whoever shows up for Dorothy. And suddenly, every person standing on that hill realized Arthur Brennan wasn't finished speaking yet. For a moment, nobody paid attention to the second envelope. The burial was underway. The pastor was speaking. The wind moved gently through the cemetery trees. Dorothy stood beside Arthur's grave, holding the first letter against her chest. Most eyes remained fixed on the casket, on the flowers, on the final goodbye. Only Reaper noticed the paper protruding from the jacket pocket. At first, he almost ignored it. The day had already delivered enough surprises for 3 lifetimes, but something made him pull it free. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe Arthur Brennan himself. Whatever the reason, a few seconds later, the old biker stood staring at the faded envelope in complete silence. Kane noticed immediately. "You okay?" Reaper didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the handwriting. Preacher stepped closer. "What is it?" Still no response. Then, Reaper slowly turned the envelope around, showing everyone, the words written across the front, "Whoever shows up for Dorothy." A strange silence spread through the cemetery. People stopped talking. The pastor stopped speaking. Even Dorothy looked up, confused. The wind seemed to disappear. The entire hill became still. Dorothy frowned. "What is that?" Reaper swallowed. "I'm not sure." But deep down, he knew. Arthur Brennan had left one final message. Not for a specific person, not for Thomas, not for Dorothy, for everyone. The old biker carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a single folded page, only one. No photographs, no documents, no secrets. Just words. Arthur's final words. Reaper unfolded the page. His hands trembled again. Not from age, not from grief, from anticipation. The entire cemetery waited. Hundreds of riders, townspeople, friends, church members, deputies, veterans, children, everyone waiting. Reaper began reading. "If you're reading this, then you showed up." A few smiles appeared immediately. Arthur's voice somehow felt alive on the page. "First, thank you. Simple, direct, Arthur. You didn't have to come. Life is busy. Gas is expensive. People get tired. The world gives us 1,000 reasons not to show up for each other. Heads slowly nodded throughout the crowd, because every word was true. But you came anyway. Silence. Maybe you knew me. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you're family. Maybe you're a stranger. Maybe you rode across town. Maybe you rode across 3 states. Several riders exchanged emotional looks, because many had done exactly that. Doesn't matter. The crowd remained completely absorbed. What matters is this. A pause. Even on paper, Arthur somehow knew how to pause, how to make people listen. You gave my wife something I can never repay. Dorothy lowered her head. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. You reminded her she isn't alone. Many people openly cried now, not because the words were complicated, because they were simple and true. After 63 years together, I worried about leaving her behind. Dorothy pressed the letter tighter against her chest. Truth is, I've worried about that for a long time. A few gentle laughs. Arthur's honesty somehow made everything hurt more and heal more at the same time. She'll pretend she's tougher than she is. The crowd laughed softly. Dorothy shook her head. Even she smiled. Don't let her fool you. More laughter, through tears. Bring her groceries when she says she doesn't need them. Check her smoke detectors. Help with the yard. Fix things she pretends aren't broken. Make sure she has somebody to call on Christmas. The emotional weight spread through the crowd like a wave, because Arthur wasn't asking for sympathy. He was assigning responsibility. Most importantly, Reaper paused. His voice caught. The final section sat near the bottom. Don't remember me because I died. The cemetery became perfectly silent. Remember me because I lived. No one moved. Remember your own people too. Call your mother. Visit your father. Take your wife to dinner. Forgive your brother. Tell your children you're proud of them. The words landed like hammer blows, simple truths, the kind people delay until it's too late. Nobody ever thinks they have enough time. Silence. They're usually wrong. Several riders lowered their heads, thinking of people they'd lost, calls they never made, conversations they postponed, apologies left unfinished. Reaper's voice trembled as he reached the final paragraph. If today taught you anything, I hope it's this. The entire hill listened. A good life isn't measured by how many people know your name. Silence. It's measured by how many people are better because you were here. No one breathed. Take care of each other. A pause, one final line, short, perfect, Arthur. And somebody please make sure Dorothy eats something. The cemetery erupted, not with loud laughter, with emotional laughter, the kind that breaks through tears, the kind that hurts and heals simultaneously. Dorothy laughed harder than anyone, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking, because after everything, after death, after grief, after heartbreak, Arthur still found a way to make her smile. When the laughter faded, something extraordinary happened. No one planned it, no one instructed it, no one organized it, yet hundreds of riders slowly stepped forward, one by one, each carrying a flower, a rose, a lily, a carnation, wildflowers, bouquets, single stems, whatever they had brought. They approached Arthur's grave and laid them down, one at a time. For nearly 20 minutes the line continued, silent, respectful, endless. Flowers covered the grave, then surrounded it, then overflowed beyond it, creating a blanket of color across the hillside. Dorothy watched the entire thing, unable to speak, unable to fully comprehend what she was seeing, because 6 days earlier she feared Arthur would be buried alone. Now, hundreds of strangers stood in line waiting to honor him. When the last flower was placed, silence returned. The kind that follows something meaningful, the kind that doesn't need words, the kind that stays with people forever. And standing there beside Arthur Brennan's grave, Thomas Reaper. Vaughn finally understood something. Arthur hadn't saved him once. He'd saved him twice. The first time as a frightened 7-year-old boy, the second time today, by reminding him what really mattered. The motorcycles were gone by sunset, at least most of them. The long lines of chrome that had stretched across Pinewood all morning slowly disappeared into the hills, into neighboring counties, onto interstates, and back toward lives waiting elsewhere. Engines faded, Roads emptied, the crowd dispersed, the flowers remained. And so did Dorothy. The cemetery had become quiet again, the way cemeteries always do, as if they patiently absorb every goodbye and then return to silence. Dorothy sat alone on a small folding chair beside Arthur's grave. The sky above Tennessee glowed orange and gold. The air had turned colder. Long shadows stretched across the hillside. She wasn't crying anymore, not because she had stopped grieving, because something inside her had changed. The fear was gone. The terrible fear that had haunted her since Arthur's death. The fear of being left behind. The fear of becoming invisible. The fear of sitting alone in a house filled with memories and silence. That fear had disappeared sometime during the day, and in its place stood something unexpected. Hope. Footsteps approached behind her. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. "Thought I'd find you here." Reaper's voice carried softly through the evening air. Dorothy smiled faintly. "Couldn't leave yet." He nodded. "I figured." The old biker lowered himself carefully onto the grass beside her. His knees protested immediately. Dorothy noticed. So Arthur wasn't the only stubborn old man. Reaper laughed. First genuine laugh all day. "Don't tell anybody." For several minutes neither spoke. They simply looked at the grave, at the flowers, at the fading sunlight, at the life that had somehow brought all of them together. Finally, Dorothy broke the silence. "You know," she stared at the headstone, "he would have liked you." Reaper smiled. "I think he would have talked too much." Dorothy laughed. "Definitely." Another silence followed, comfortable this time, the kind shared between people who no longer need explanations. Then Dorothy looked at him. "What happens now?" The question hung in the air, simple, yet heavy, because both of them understood what she really meant. What happens tomorrow? What happens next week? What happens when the casseroles stop arriving, when the sympathy cards stop coming? When the funeral becomes a memory? What happens when grief settles into ordinary life? Reaper looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "You remember what Arthur asked?" Dorothy smiled sadly. "Which part?" "About taking care of you." A small laugh escaped her. "Oh, Lord. I'm serious." "I know. So am I." She looked at him carefully, trying to determine whether he meant it. Then she remembered the motorcycles, the riders, the chapel, the letter, and realized she already knew the answer. The next morning, somebody knocked on Dorothy's front door. At exactly 8:03 a.m., she opened it. A young rider stood there holding groceries. "Morning, ma'am." Dorothy blinked. "What is this?" The rider smiled. "Arthur's orders." 2 days later, another rider arrived. He fixed a broken porch rail, refused payment, quoted Arthur's letter, left. A week later, somebody mowed her lawn. 2 weeks later, someone replaced a faulty smoke detector. 3 weeks later, a group from Knoxville delivered firewood. At Christmas, 17 Christmas cards arrived, everyone signed by someone who attended the funeral. Some included phone numbers, some included photographs, some included invitations. Everyone ended the same way. "Call if you need anything." Then spring arrived. The Tennessee hills turned green. The flowers around Arthur's grave began blooming. And Dorothy Brennan discovered something remarkable. The house didn't feel empty anymore. Not because Arthur was gone. He still was. She still missed him every day, still reached for him in bed sometimes, still caught herself listening for his footsteps, still spoke to his photograph when nobody else was around. That part never changed. But loneliness did. Loneliness changed, because Arthur had accidentally left her 600 extended family members. One afternoon in April, Reaper pulled into her driveway. This time he wasn't alone. 3 motorcycles followed him, then 4. Then 6. Dorothy stepped onto the porch laughing before they even shut off their engines. "What are you people doing now?" Kane climbed off his bike, holding a toolbox. Bulldog unloaded lumber. Preacher carried measuring equipment. Reaper looked up at the roof, then pointed. "You got damage," Dorothy sighed. "I knew I shouldn't have mentioned that." "You mentioned it. I was making conversation." Too late. She laughed again. Arthur would have laughed too. Throughout the summer, the visits continued. Birthdays were remembered, holidays were shared, problems were solved, stories were exchanged. Dorothy learned names, Faces, families, histories, the riders learned hers. Slowly, naturally, without anyone announcing it, she became part of their world, and they became part of hers. Then came October, nearly 1 year after Arthur's funeral, a cool autumn morning, very similar to the day everything began. Dorothy stood beside Arthur's grave carrying a small bouquet. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful, beautiful. She arranged the flowers carefully, then sat down, as she often did, to talk, to remember, to visit. After several minutes, the familiar sound of motorcycles echoed through the distance. Dorothy smiled immediately, without even looking, because she knew, every year, on the same day, they came back, not hundreds, not 600, just enough, enough to remember, enough to honor, enough to keep a promise. The first motorcycle appeared over the hill, then another, then another. Reaper led the group, older now, slower perhaps, but still riding, still showing up, exactly as Arthur would have done. They parked near the cemetery gate, walked toward her, carrying flowers, smiling, laughing, family, real family, not by blood, by choice. Reaper stopped beside Arthur's grave, looked down at the headstone, then nodded once. "Morning, Arthur," the others smiled. Dorothy laughed. "You still talk to him?" "Yep," he answered. "Not yet," Kane grinned. "He's probably tired of hearing from you." The group laughed, even Dorothy. For a moment they all stood there together, looking at the headstone, remembering, honoring, appreciating. And as the autumn wind moved gently through the trees, Dorothy realized something. Arthur had gotten his wish. Not the funeral, not the crowd, not the flowers, something bigger. He had made sure neither of them would ever be alone. Years later, people in Pinewood would still talk about the funeral. The day hundreds of bikers came for a carpenter. The day a widow's promise was saved. The day strangers became family. But they always got one detail wrong. They thought the story was about motorcycles, or Hell's Angels, or the crowd. It wasn't. The story was about a single act of kindness. A young man stopping beside a highway in 1963. A frightened little boy standing in the rain. A decision that took less than an hour. And the ripple it created for more than 60 years. Because Arthur Brennan had been right. A good life isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by how many lives are better because you were here. And on a quiet hill in Tennessee, surrounded by flowers and friends, the proof of that truth stood in plain sight.